Welcome to a very interesting, consecutively two seminars by Dr. Paul Flather. These seminars are being co-convened by the Center for European Studies and the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. Shout out to Dean Sudarshan for enabling.
You should be coming later.
For enabling the connection. So. Before we start, I'll just briefly introduce the speaker and then I'll let Dr. Flather take on with the seminars. So Dr. Flather is a Supernumerary Fellow, Secretary General of the Europaeum at the Mansfield College, Oxford. He is very well published and has been working in journalism, working with BBC, Times, New Statesman. He was the deputy editor there. His research focuses on Indian democracy, on race equality groups in the UK. He also remains involved with charities, civic bodies, race bodies. He chairs Noon Educational Foundation, supporting Pakistani scholars to study at top UK universities. Also, since the 1980s, he's been chairing the London-wide Committee on Post-School Education, so a part of the widening participation framework, I suppose. He's worked for 4 years for the Open Society Foundation, setting up a variety of international Soros programs, and was founding Secretary General and CEO of the Central European University, which was originally set up in Prague, Budapest, and Warsaw after 1989 revolutions. And of course, it has an interesting future with CU as well, right now in Vienna. So he was the Director of International and External Affairs at Oxford University for 5 years until 2000. He took MA, BA, DPhil at Balliol College, Oxford. So he's going to be presenting 2 seminars back-to-back with a half-an-hour break in between. First one entitled English Exceptionalism and the Thousand-Year Road Towards Brexit. And the second one would be An Epic Act of Self-Harm, the UK, Brexit, and the Challenges Ahead. So, over to you, Dr. Flather, and welcome to OP Jindal Global University for the 4th time.
Thank you very much, Rohi. I mean, I have been here a number of times. I always enjoy coming here. But actually, as we were talking just now, it's the first time I've been linked to the European Centre, so I'm very delighted to be here. I have ended up doing a lot of work on Europe because it's inevitable. So it's very nice to be, there we are. It's very nice to be here, and thank you all for coming. So this is slightly unusual. What I wanted to do was to present all of you will know something about the Brexit story, and all of you will be puzzled about what is a kind of a paradoxical situation that the Brits have got into. And rather than giving you, I thought I'd do something slightly special for you, which is to try and dig really deep into the background roots and historical roots, which may help explain why the vote came out in a certain way and why we seem to be trapped in what I will describe as a kind of a democratic gridlock. Okay, so the first part is really digging deeper. Now, we will cover some of the more recent reasons that led up to the vote in this process, but it's not the usual lecture, which will just look at the 5-10 reasons that have looked that have come up in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. I'm going to go quite far back. I've rather provocatively called it a 1,000-year road to Brexit. I think I did this because I gave this to a Chinese group. And they always like 1,000-year roads. Actually, it's only about 600, as you'll find out, but I've kept the title. So that'll be the first half, and I guess I'll talk for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of discussion. Then we have a bit of a break, and then we'll come back to look a little bit more practically at the kind of relationships and challenges that Britain faces, and the relationship with Europe. Okay, and then in a way, I want you to help me try to solve this problem. We've got about 50 days left before we get to the cliff edge. Okay, right. So who knows? You can think out of the box. We can get there. Okay. Now I'm going to go very quickly on the slides. They're all images basically. So don't worry if you miss a slide. I mean, it's not that a particular slide matters. It's just the general impressions of what I'm saying. Some of it is to do with imperialism, colonialism, which is obviously I'm going to go very quickly because this audience is very familiar with that. But let's just, before I start, let me just say that the situation is strange. The clock is ticking, okay, for a crisis. We're approaching the cliff edge, and every day, a bit like the kind of build-up to the Indian elections, every day there's a kind of new crisis, and there's some. We don't have Arnab Goswami, but there's the equivalent is kind of on TV, sort of talking about, you know, will this happen, will that happen, will there be... I mean, over the weekend there was a crisis over ferries. Mm-hmm. If we don't stay in, we're going to need to set up new ferry systems. Yeah. And we've given a contract to a company that didn't have ferries, and then it got cancelled over the weekend. So every day, and then today there's discussion about Mrs. May meeting Corbyn. So every day there's something very big happening, and if we get near to the cliff edge, then people are talking about the fact that we might crash out with no deal. No deal means that actually you don't have a specific deal. It doesn't mean there's no deal at all. It just means that we'll be trading under the general World Trade Organization rules, and it'll be like England in the 60s. You know, we'll have to come back to the old kind of arrangements, which nobody's used to. And since we export something like 40% plus to Europe under free trade, obviously, and then those goods will have tariffs, it'll be very, very serious. But then for Europe also, substituting, is that this John? 4% to us, they will also suffer. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to look deeper and try to understand the emotional politics that's been involved. Because I think emotion is something that's come back into politics, and particularly in the 21st century. It always was there, but somehow we were so rational in our analyses that we forgot about emotion. And then the second one is to look at the kind of challenges. So let's just for a second think about this. This is what happened on the 24th of June 2016, and many of us woke up with an enormous headache. I'm a kind of junkie, so I stayed up all night, and we watched this man, Nigel Farage, and you don't have to, some of you won't be familiar with all these figures, it doesn't matter, it's just just get the mood and the general lines that I want to talk about in this session. So Nigel Farage appeared several times. He appeared on television at about 11 o'clock saying, oh, we made a good attempt, or we didn't make it, because nobody expected the Brexit vote to actually get through. And then he came back on television at about 2 o'clock saying, don't go to bed, things are changing. And then he came on television about 4 or 5 o'clock and said, this is England's Freedom Day, right? Which is a bit of a misnomer, particularly now that we have the facts. So this was the big day, and I thought the New York Times, which remains perhaps the best newspaper around, had a fantastic headline just the next morning. Britain stuns the world, we vote to leave. How do we explain this? Because our friend Will Hutton, who's at Oxford and head of Hertford College, wrote this wonderful article and called it an epic act of self-harm. Okay, so this is the paradox that we're going to explore this afternoon. How did this great, very bizarre, strange decision happen? So 3 short-term reasons before we go into the longer-term reasons. One was money. Okay, there was a narrative that Britain, we actually give about 8.5 billion a year to Europe. And there was a feeling that this was a waste of time. A recent poll actually asked Brits, was this good value? And less than a third said it was good value. And the narrative was because our media is very anti-Europe, has never actually got to grips with explaining the benefits of Europe. And of course politicians, if something good happens, always claim that they did it. If something bad happens, they blame Europe. So the narrative was very, very strongly stuck. When the Exeters produced this bus, which said that somehow we get all this money and we could spend it on our ailing health service, that was very, very popular. And in fact, what we've discovered, as you'll discover later on in my talks, not only are we not getting this money, but we're actually having to spend a lot, 39 billion extra. The second key narrative that, in a sense, came just before the vote was about migration. And to be frank and fair, there are many, many countries across Europe that are challenged by migration. And what happens is they muddle migration from third parties together with what we call free movement. Now, if you imagine, Europe is about, I mean, it can be compared to India in a sense, in continental sense. Now, you have free movement in India, and it causes quite a lot of anxiety. If you're a Maharashtrian, you know, you've got the Shiv Sena complaining about Biharis and so on coming in. Well, if you imagine in Europe the same situation where people are moving from countries which are less developed to countries that are more developed or have more opportunities, in a sense it helps the economy, but it can also form a threat if large numbers come. And that's what happened to Britain. And so this is Mr. Farage again with this very provocative poster talking about migration and playing up fears, particularly in a recession, which is what happened after the 2008 global crash, which affected Britain. I mean, in India somehow it didn't bite, but we were very exposed. And the third big issue was about taking back control. And I'm going to talk about sovereignty, and I'll come back to this, but it's a very attractive slogan. Let's take back control. Somehow, you know, it's gone to Brussels, it's gone away from us. We're sort of individuals in a globalized world, and we're losing our sense of our belonging and being. And it's very attractive, but what the hell does it mean? What is control? Who do you get it from? Can you actually take it back in a multinational complex world? So on and so forth. So what happens is that we have the vote, and this very respected magazine, I think this image sums it up before. So immediately we're now behind the scenes, and we're going to face a huge amount of challenge. We have the French papers who've never quite got over the fact that we won quite a few wars, and they didn't, wishing us good luck. Okay, so this is where we are, and I talked about the cliff edge. So let me talk first of all about exceptionalism. There is a in historical terms, every country often feels that it's slightly exceptional, okay? And is a kind of a discourse that can be set. Yeah, that'll help. Okay, does that help? Yes, that's wonderful. There is this idea that many countries have a degree of exceptionalism, and that it helps to explain a particular historical set of actions. And one has to be a little bit cautious, because if you go too far in that, you can never do comparative politics, and you can't kind of enjoy the kind of analysis. But if you go back to writers like Herder and Fichte in German history, they started this whole idea of looking at countries and their kind of particular exceptional trajectory. So in Germany they talk about a Volk rather than a state. But for example, Israel always talks about it being God's chosen country. The United States always feels very exceptional. China talks about the country that has everything under heaven, all under heaven is Chinese. You talk about Holy Russia. France always talks about its great civilizing mission after the French Revolution. Australia talks about God's own country. And Britain also feels, and we'll see this in the writings of many, from Shakespeare through to Churchill, this kind of very special kind of discourse of ideas. And when you've got, this is Rupert Murdoch, you've got the kind of media setting a narrative of Britain being a very special island country that has won a lot of wars and have a kind of special history. This is part of what I want to explore in this first talk about this particular kind of narrative. And you can then set it in, and this is the European Studies Centre, so it's good to mention this, you can set it in a wider context, the work of someone like Niall Ferguson, who talks about Europe having contributed enormously to world civilization. And its contribution, he talks about medicine, he talks about rationality, he talks about science, he talks about the process of reform, talks about governmental structures and so on. He has, I think, 6 points. And if you set it within that wider narrative, and writers like Huntington, who always talk about somehow that Europe is the defender of the Enlightenment, they just haven't read their Indian history back to 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. They haven't understood the Arab Enlightenment. And there are many more discoveries that we'll make about the kind of roots and what we call the circulation of ideas. But there is this narrative still lingering in Europe. I think it's waning finally, about the special place of Europe. And I like this. A.J.P. Taylor was a famous historian in the 40s and 50s. And he used to talk about the underlying factors, but he also used to talk, now that's why I don't want you to forget this, about things that finally trigger a decision. So he has this famous story about how, for example, Richard III, he didn't get a horse, he couldn't mount up, so he lost that particular battle, and then his dynasty lost the monarchy. So it is about narratives and discourses, and we're going to talk about exceptionalism. But I don't want you to forget the little things. So these are some of the countries I mentioned that have particular views of exceptionalism. So how did Britain get to its exceptionalism? I'm going to start by going back to the Reformation. This is Martin Luther. It says nailing his 95 theses. That's how we always were told it. I've discovered that he didn't nail them, he pasted them. And he didn't have 95, he had 78. But that's, you have to be kind of historian to get into that. So this kind of Reformation period starts, and it coincides with this crisis. I thought this version here, I put this slide in for you because the Reformation in Britain, John Wycliffe, Master of Balliol, where we both studied together, was one of the great instigators, and he translates the Bible into English and so on. And Jan Hus, great figure in the Czech Republic. So the Reformation spreads, and it coincides with this enormous crisis in the British monarchy over getting a male heir. And I think you probably do know this story. I don't know if you still study much English history, but Henry VIII needed an heir and needed a divorce, and he commissioned these two characters on the right, Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cranmer, to do this. And the Pope wasn't granting him a divorce, so eventually they decided to break with Rome. And I'm going to argue that actually this is a decisive moment in British history. It's decisive because it's our first Brexit, okay? We actually break with the rest of Europe. We break with the Holy Roman Empire, and we break with Catholicism, and we actually give the king the divine power as head. He's the head of the English Church. So what becomes the Anglican Church emerges with a whole set of different values, Protestant values, and there's a lot of discussion, interesting literature about the ethics and so on. And Weber wrote a famous book about the contribution to a new form of capitalism and so on. We don't have to get into that. All we need to know is that the king now is in a sense slightly divine, he's independent, and Britain is on a different trajectory. Of course, there are ebbs and flows. So we have Mary, his daughter, comes to power later on because the succession, the boy actually dies very quickly. So from 1553 to 58, we're back to Catholicism, and then these great fires, and actually the key martyrs were actually burnt in Oxford, just opposite Balliol. But by and large, we move forward. Oh, there's the monument in Oxford, if you ever come there. We move forward in a Protestant way, and we've never had a Catholic Prime Minister. And Tony Blair was a secret Catholic, but he only declared himself Catholic after he'd ended his prime ministership. So we're still very, this kind of residue from 1530 is still there. This is the famous bonfire, gunpowder plot, and from that we have this bonfire night in November where we actually burn guys. Nowadays, because of political correctness, you can't burn a guy, But I mean, it's not because he's a man as opposed to a woman, but just the burning of it is kind of considered, oh, it's too offensive for people.
Yeah.
But so what I want to do is to remind us of how this notion of English exceptionalism, this specialism, emerges, and there can be no better. I don't know if you can read that, but there's no better, I think, quote than this marvelous one from Shakespeare, and talking about the kind of specialness and this sceptred isle. I mean, if you can just read that, I'm not going to read it out, but it's beautiful, poetic, and it gives the English a sense of their specialness, which is now going to be coupled with other things and leads to what we call the kind of Anglosphere, and this kind of sense of difference and influence in the world, and the kind of special relationship. And you get writers like Churchill producing this volume of work, and if you like, also talking about, I talked about the French seeing themselves as civilizing, the British, he saw the British young men as going off and civilizing different parts of the world. Famous speech by Disraeli to that effect. So this is the first idea I want to give you. The second idea I want to talk about is sovereignty and consent. And you'll know that in Britain we don't have a constitution. We rely on common law and precedent. But the crucial developments from this, obviously going back to Magna Carta, will be actually force the king, who wants to raise more taxes, we force him to agree that he needs the consent, not of the people in this case, just the barons. But it's a turning point. I mean, it's a turning point that all European nations look to. It's a little bit romantic because actually he doesn't enforce the law, and there's kind of battles in 1216, 1217, 1218 after he dies. It's only about till 1265 in Simon de Montfort's Parliament where actually kind of it's enforced. But the language of consent in the Magna Carta is just terrific. The really crucial moment, I suppose, comes, and there's nothing like beheading a king to change the terms of trade, to change the terms of governance. So we actually become the first nation to behead a king during the Civil War. It's done reluctantly, it's done slightly accidentally by Cromwell, but it does mean, as Quentin Skinner, the famous historian, said this, we become de facto the first republic since Roman times. I know the king comes back in 1660, there's a restoration, but his powers are forever limited. Here is the great hero, of course very controversial, and many people don't approve of him because he was also, he massacred people, particularly in Ireland, so on. But this is the figure outside our parliament. It's symbolizing that sovereignty has moved from the king, Henry VIII, to parliament. But the really crucial figure, of course, is John Locke. And in his wonderful treatise on government, he talks about the notion of consent. And he introduces this idea, and I don't know how familiar you are with the notion of contract theory, but he says that basically consent must be given to anyone who is a ruler, to allow him, now her as well, thankfully, to rule on behalf of the people. So it becomes a touchstone of political theory. And at that time there's a great kind of debate with other writers like Grotius and Hobbes, who want to emphasize much more stability and security, and so actually want to believe in the power of the state as it exists, which in a way is defending the old monarchical structure. But what Locke is doing as a revolutionary moment is saying that whoever you choose, you have to choose to give them consent. And why it's so important to our story today and generally is that if you are asked or you are obliged to give consent, you then have the right to remove consent. Okay, and that's the key idea for me in democracy. It's the idea that you can remove something. The key moment in Indian democracy wasn't 1950, it was 1977. Okay, when you actually removed consent from Mrs. Gandhi. You could say 1980 was also a key moment because you then returned it to her, but the people were expressing their support, okay, and it's very kind of important. So this is the idea in Locke's writing. I'll just put the quote up for you. So what happens is that now you've got Parliament as being the sovereign power, and the Queen in Parliament is there, but all she's doing is reading out a document which has been written for her by the Prime Minister. Nowadays, behind the scenes, my mother's in the House of Lords, I get some of the gossip, and she says, God, the writing, they can't write as they used to, their grammar is awful. And she can actually, she used to be able to change some of the semicolons and things. Go insert. But now she can't change anything, she finds it quite tedious and badly written. But for our purposes, you've now got this double problem, because you've got the European Parliament introducing many laws. People can't quite agree how many laws they introduce. It could be, some people say 25% of British law, some people say it's up to 85%. It depends what you mean by a law, because it could be a proportion of the law, or it could be the framework of the law, and so on. But for sure, a huge proportion of British law, as for all other European countries, is introduced, and often very progressively and very thankfully by Brussels. But it means that there is a dual centre for consent, for sovereignty, and that's what annoys people, okay? And then the British press, the wonderful British press who don't like anything in Europe, talk about the interferences. So the Human Rights Act, interference there. They talk about the fact that Brussels tells you that bananas must be certain shape and they can't be other shapes, and so on. And going back to the famous image there of the Brexiteers, it goes to the heart of our idea of taking back control. And why it's so important is that in 1975, when we actually went in, we actually went in 73, but in 1975 we were promised a referendum. In 1975 the referendum came, and most people didn't want to go in at the beginning of the referendum, but by the end, 2-1 in favour of going in. So in a sense they gave consent, they were allowed to give consent, which actually then reflects back on the 2016 referendum. Here is Mr Cameron promising a referendum, an in-and-out referendum, and he does so for political reasons. He's very worried about the rise of the UKIP party, and he wants to sort of exorcise it once and for all, and that leads us to the crisis. Have I done something wrong now? I was going to go back. So that leads us to the crisis that we're going to be discussing more. So the next idea I want to talk about is imperial. So I've talked about consent. I've talked about the exceptionalism, the different island story. Is about the empire. And I'm going to go through this very quickly, because you're all very familiar with this idea of English imperialism, the British Empire of the 19th century, very famous Battle of Plassey, in which a young accountant, he was a rogue. Clive was such a rogue that his family couldn't ship him off to India quickly enough, and instead of doing his accountancy, he started mucking around and training troops up and down and so on, rose up the ranks. And then, of course, they bribed the various Indian princes not to join the French and won the Battle of Plassey. So in a way, they kind of took India by the back door. So these kind of images you're very familiar with, famous Darbar in 1910. It seems that my great-great-great-grandfather was involved in organising that. So there you are, I've got Indian origins. So this kind of imperialism feeds into what one might call this new nationalism that is so prevalent. What happened there? Kinds of nationalism that we're seeing, this kind of idea of America first, which has been translated into many other countries. And the image that you saw there was with Trump and Putin and various others, front of the Economist magazine, and in the background was our little annoying hero, Mr. Farage, beating the drum for Britain. And this kind of rise of nationalism plays into into our story. And Boris Johnson, who is, you'll see later, often does talk about the kind of imperial nostalgia of Britain, and they plays up on the kind of threat of migration, which is one of the contributory factors, then comes into this story as well. The next thing I'm going to talk about is what I've called the Invincibility Myth, okay? And it's this idea that Britain often harks back to its enormous military successes. And actually, if you look back on British history, it is a series of amazing success stories. But there's no reason why that should continue to influence current history. But there are politicians, and there is this kind of sense, this mindset, which actually does hark back to it. So some of the images that I was going to show you, there's the Battle of Agincourt, famously, in 1415, when the British, English archers and so on are outnumbered by 6 or 7 to 1, but they beat the French army using their longbows. And this is all kind of described by a French chronicler called Monstrelet. And 10,000 French people are killed and only 600 Brits, and it's captured, of course, famously in Shakespeare's play. Then you have things like the Spanish Armada, where Britain was seriously expected to be defeated by the French, and again with some kind of good luck and a favourable wind. In 1588 they escaped that, and then it's claimed as a huge kind of victory. You get other battles. Quebec, you get Trafalgar is another battle where it's not the guy. Again, the Napoleon was set to kind of overtake and capture the British and defeat them, and you get a major victory by Nelson, the Battle of Trafalgar, and the Battle of Waterloo, where Wellington wins. And most famously, of course, in the Second World War, 1940. And many people have compared the Brexit crisis to what it was like in 1940, except they say there is no decent leader. Very, very high expectation that the Germans would win the air battles, and of course Churchill famously never has so much been owed by so many to so few, that famous kind of quote. So this idea of the invincibility is that somehow Britain, if you look back at its history, it always can succeed. Somehow it can always get out of this mess. And so this kind of informs, when you explain to Brexiteers, well, actually this looks like a hell of a mess, and there doesn't seem to be any route out, they say, well, we'll strike a deal, we'll manage, we've always managed before. And to some extent, I mean, you have to say, well, somehow Britain has kind of managed before. But you could say that we've actually been declining quite seriously since 1945. The society was radically reformed after 1945, when actually Churchill was surprisingly defeated and the Attlee Labour government came in and introduced a whole bunch of new reforms. Now we could say that actually Britain is kind of in trouble. And you remember the famous quote from, I think, John Foster Dulles, Britain has lost an empire but has not found a role. And we've been trying to find that role, and partly relying on what we euphemistically have called the special relationship with America. Many people have pointed out that actually we've often had to increasingly just do the bidding of America, and it hasn't been a kind of relationship of equals. But obviously the fact that we are close to America and we share intelligence and often support each other's relatively poor foreign policy, then that has given us a kind of event. The next thing, and I'm just going to plough on without the slides. I mean, we can't find them, can we? It's a pity.
I'm going to...
Is to talk about protest. What I want to suggest to you that in a sense Nigel Farage and the so what did he do? is in a way can be seen, I think, legitimately as in that tradition of protest.
It's back on.
Yeah, but what's he doing? Can you get rid of this?
एक मिनट इधर आ जाइए.
Oh, it's working?
हाँ.
Okay.
Oh, ठीक.
So this was just simply the thing about the invincibility. Was it? This is about the empire. So you've got, this is a nice image of Boris Johnson with it's all talking. I mean, he makes speeches about the empire. He kind of sees himself as a latter-day Churchill. He's actually written a biography of Churchill, a rather poor one. And he kind of sees himself, he's a very good orator, another man from our college, so we're kind of responsible for good and bad things. This was the Invincible, so this is Agincourt, you know, these are some of the famous battles, the Spanish Armada, the Battle of Quebec, where the French didn't expect the British to climb up the cliff, the Battle of Trafalgar, so I'm just going to the Battle of Waterloo. So from this point, where Britain was still a kind of superpower, but now kind of operating within NATO, and this was a special relationship. So talking about people's protests, so there is this tradition of rebellion, and there's this famous rebellion, the Peasants Revolt, led by Wat Tyler, and they actually take over London. They actually get into the Tower of London, but they don't really want to take over the country. They're kind of surprised by their own success, and the king comes out to meet them, and he says, "Well, I'll sort this out, and I'll listen to you." This is over protest over the poll tax, and of course he immediately imprisons them, tries them, and then hangs them. So in those days, you just kind of dealt with opposition like that. This is the famous frontispiece by William Morris, which is talking about the sort of old, kind of our equivalent of Gandhi's Ram Raja, you know, when everyone was equal and life was very, very kind of smooth. Dissolution of monasteries, that was a kind of protest, obviously organised by the king, but it led to a complete turning around of elites and the rise of the middle classes. There's another famous moment, I'm going to skip that, but in the Putney debates, when the soldiers, Cromwell's soldiers meet and debate, the first time they talk about universal suffrage, the equality of women, there's this great tradition. This is when the trade union movement started. These wonderful farmers decided to form what was called a combination, a kind of group of supporting each other, because their wages were so low they couldn't even feed their families. And they decided to stop working as farmers and fruit pickers. But there was a law that prevented you from actually, if you're a worker, from being in an organised group. And they were sentenced to, all they wanted was 10 shillings a week. And they were sentenced to 7 years penal servitude abroad. But the country rose up in support of them, and they had to be brought back, and trade unions were legitimised. So what I want to talk about is this kind of battle between the Roundhead, who's the protester, Cromwell, against the king, who is the kind of status quo. And if you like, you can see that the chap on the left, who always holds a pint of beer, you know, Mr. Farage, the man of the people, leading the revolt of the people against the aristocrat from, I'm afraid, Oxford, but he's not from Balliol, thankfully. The sort of aristocrat, PR, smooth guy chap, you know, went to all the wrong clubs at Oxford and misbehaved. You know, you can see, and I'm just slightly kind of tongue-in-cheek, but you can see that this kind of tradition of which has infected British politics. So it's fine. This is a fine tradition of protest, but it's been obviously mishandled. And there he is with his party. And the party does really well, particularly in the European elections. I mean, they get 20-25% of the vote. So the Conservatives actually treat this as a major threat. And it's because they see this as eating into their vote bank, to use an Indian term, that he decides to have a referendum which will once and for all kill this issue. And of course he thinks he's going to win, and he misjudges the mood. I think we'll come back to that later. So this is still the long-term story, and I want to now look at free trade, because free trade has been a huge part of the British story. So this is London in 1600 emerging as a major financial centre. This is London today. It is the world's financial centre. Of course, we can now think that it might lose its preeminence with Brexit. But trade has been very much a part of the English story, and trade which somehow did without kind of tariffs. I mean, there is this underlying idea, and we can talk about it from Adam Smith, who introduced the idea that it's no use making something in your country if it can be made somewhere else much cheaper. I mean, I haven't quite quoted him exactly, but he had those words in The Wealth of Nations. And if you like, that's the singular idea of international trade. And the Brits have always, always paid homage to this. I mean, ups and downs and so on and so forth. And certainly within the empire, they had a protective tariff notion. But there was this underlying commitment to free trade. This is the Napoleon called us a nation of shopkeepers. And The Economist, which is, still the thing to read, is set up as a journal of free trade. And what happens is there's a major kind of crisis in 1846 because corn has been kept artificially high to help the farmers, but the country is getting very poor. People are beginning to starve. Certainly in Ireland there's this huge kind of famine, and there's a big crisis within the Conservative Party. And what's happened is that Peel, the Prime Minister, actually then repeals the corn laws, breaks his party and loses his power. And I think this is very interesting because it actually is what Mrs. May could do. Mrs. May could, in a sense, change the terms of the negotiations, but she seems to be so wedded to maintaining the party that she's taking us, as I say, nearer and nearer the cliff. This notion of trade, this is the corn laws, and this is Peel repealing them. And this is another crisis in 1905 when there is this notion that somehow we ought to have a special sort of tariff against the colonies. And that is defeated as this debate between Baldwin and Balfour. So this debate about trade, which is the same debate we're having now about whether we should have, we should stay in within the free trade thing, or we should actually just go out of the customs union and somehow survive in the world. It's the same issue that's been going on in the British political class discussion since 1600. This is about...
Do we stop in another 5-6 minutes?
Yes, why not?
Yeah.
And then the globalization crisis, which hit England very much, didn't affect India, has kind of underlined it. And the fact that the economy has done so badly, what are we doing? I think we stop at 15:15, don't we? And then we start. Yeah, I think we stop at 15:15. I'm going to stop in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and we'll talk a little bit. Yeah. But so on top of this debate about trade has really come the 2008 globalization crisis, followed by the Euro crisis, and to some extent Britain was outside that because we never joined the Euro. But it still affected us because we were affected by the impact on the rest of Europe, where growth collapsed down to 1%. And we, because of our treaty obligations, still had to contribute to bailing out countries like Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. And there you see the sort of ticking clock of those countries. And what that did do is, on top of this idea of globalization, is create this notion of the left-behinders. And they form a crucial part of the Brexit vote. So what you get is, with outsourcing and with manufacturing declining, in Britain, you get a huge group of people who feel that somehow they've been excluded from the kind of growth engine, the benefits, and they come down and they look at London where people are getting £1 or £2 million bonuses, and going out and enjoying themselves, and they are living in the northeast and the northwest and not actually getting the kind of benefit of it. And they get very frustrated with these the Bank of England, these kind of institutions. This is not for today, but often kind of thinking about what Mr. Keynes would have said. He often had. So I want to end this section by saying that because of these ideas of sovereignty, of exceptionalism, of trade, of imperial nostalgia, of kind of difference, of this kind of island mentality, it's created a kind of us and them idea. And it starts from 1945 because Britain is the ostensive winner of the last war. The other European countries have all been occupied and affected by the war. This is Attlee's great victory, which I mentioned to you earlier. And when Europe is set up in 56, we're not there. We're not there because we're not sure we want to be there. We think that we have the Commonwealth, we have our friendship with America, our economy is doing well. And if we are there, we want to be in charge. We don't want to be one of the group of six signing the Treaty of Rome. And as the Europe develops from the common market and begins to expand, we discover that actually our economy is not doing nearly as well as we thought. So by the 1960s, where our growth rate is something like 2% a year, but the European growth rate is above 4%. And we get rather anxious, and we're seeing that we're falling behind. So we actually apply to join, and President de Gaulle, who's the President of France, actually says no to us. And he says no twice formally and once informally. So he's kind of non. And we try several times in the 60s to join. His ostensive argument is that he thinks that if we join, we'll begin to dominate it, and not only will we begin to dominate Europe, but we'll bring the Americans in. Okay, somehow it'll become American influence, and he doesn't want that. But some people also feel that he was kind of enjoying the fact that he might be able to exclude the British, because he'd had to, he lived obviously in the bunker with Churchill during the war, and he never quite got over the psychology of the fact that actually the French had lost and depended on the British. I've read a magnificent biography of him over the summer, and he's a very strange, complex, quite unpleasant man, but obviously he's a heroic figure who is always there at crucial points in history for France. So we don't get in until there is a change of personnel, and Heath comes in and Pompidou comes in France, and we get this referendum in 75. And these are the Brexiteers. And funny enough, the Brexiteers are the Labour people, mainly, okay? And this is kind of ironic. And when the referendum starts, there's a 2-to-1 majority against going in. When it ends, there's a 2-to-1 majority for going in. So it's completely the reverse of what happens in 2016, okay? And where Labour, although Labour wasn't very active in 2016, we can discuss that, they were more pro, and the Tories were more against. So it's a complete reversal of that. And here's Mr. Heath smiling when the results come in. And we then move on to Mrs. Thatcher, who, if you like, is a reluctant Remainer. I mean, you can see there's Delors, the president. I love this image because you can see that if he could move further to the left, away from the desk, he would. They're really uncomfortable bedfellows there. And Mrs. Thatcher, she finds herself in Europe, and actually she's quite a rational politician, although she has her emotional moments. And he's a socialist and she's a kind of conservative, so they don't kind of get on. He's producing all these welfare protections, industrial relations protections, trade union protections, which is contrary to what she stands for. But so you get this kind of stuff. You know, our famous press is so anti-Europe. And Mrs. Thatcher actually gets exactly what she wants. You know, she gets the rebate, she gets the single market, which is back to our trade, this idea of competitive trade and set of rules, and she also gets enlargement. And we want enlargement because we want to dilute the influence of Germany and France, okay? And also some of the new countries are more likely to be more friendly to Britain. So she gets those three major policy ideas. And by the way, British civil servants are dominating in Europe. They're running the committees, they're writing the reports, they're very popular because they're very good at, and English is the de facto language. And Brits are generally good at writing recommendations and getting stuff done. You know, that's kind of they're quite good admin types. You know, from the Romans and the Normans and so on. And we have this in common with Indians, but a little bit better at implementation, perhaps. So Mrs. Thatcher is doing this, and then she gets up and makes this important speech in 1988, in which she begins to distance herself from Europe. So we get back to us and them. We get back to that quality where she doesn't want Europe to interfere with the sovereignty of Britain. It's this kind of parliament, and then you get the rise of UKIP, and you get that kind of difference. So really what I've been trying to tell you is that these roots of difference, which surfaced, flared up, and had local and recent stimulus, actually were fanned by these long, deeply held prejudices and views which can go back 600 years or more. Of course, it's influenced by the narratives and the discourses, and the media have a crucial part to play. But this is the result of that. Then you can see all the magazines and papers responding, and then we get to Article 50, in which we agree. By the way, this was drawn up by a British senior civil servant. There was no way of leaving Europe, but when they actually revised the Lisbon Treaty, they thought, well, we better have a kind of exit rule, and then they gave this 2-year deadline to it. And this is where I'm going to stop at the first half, and then we'll get into the kind of more policy stuff in a moment. So this is where we've got to now, and I think what people forget is that it's potentially quite a big disaster for Britain, and we're going to talk about. I'm going to tell you why, the challenges that we kind of face in a moment. But I think what people underestimate is how serious it is for Europe. And one of the puzzles for me as a European, because Europe is about it's a new political animal, it's a new game, it's a new way of doing politics. Some people talk about it as a new kind of empire, but not an old empire, an empire where you voluntarily join to get certain benefits and establish kind of commonalities. So in the Roman Empire you had a common citizenship, and in Europe they're developing a common citizenship, but the old empire was through force. And this is through voluntary cooperation. But if you lose one of your biggest members, it's going to be a huge blow to Europe, financially, politically, in terms of defence and so on. But we'll talk about that in a moment. And I cannot understand why there is this fairly entrenched view about not negotiating and not giving one or two little, they can withdraw them afterwards. I mean, you know, politics is a long game. Giving one or two little amendments and things on mobility, which would allow Britain to somehow deal with its gridlock and impasse. So on. So let's pause there.
Shall we open the floor to questions?
Yes, please.
All right. Okay. So if you just could tell your name and then ask the question. So we'll take 2 questions at a time. So yourself and Jessica. Yeah.
I'm Jessica from JSLH. Okay, now I think this is something that you tried to bring across in this history, but I want to prod you a bit more to talk about how global factors and exceptionalism and the specific trajectory of Britain interact. Because I remember you had one slide on the new nationalisms. So in a sense, what we are seeing in Turkey, what we are seeing in India, in America, Philippines, is a worldwide phenomenon which is being referred to as populism, rise of the right wing and so on. But then at the same time, in each of these countries, there's something specific to where they are in terms of the history of democracy, in terms of political identities and so on. So in the case of Britain, to what extent would you say that there is this interaction between what is specific to Britain and what is going on globally? You did mention the recession, but I think in terms of nationalism and so on, I just want to sort of prod you to talk a bit more about that.
Okay, Jessica?
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was a really excellent broader historical context, and actually, as a Brit as well, makes me feel quite sick about the next month or so until the vote happens. I have a couple of connected questions. Your narrative makes absolute sense and brings a lot of kind of context to the situation we're facing. There are a couple of things I felt were missing, and I wanted to see how they fit into this analysis. Firstly, when you talked about the kind of the history of rebellion that Britain has, why is this missing now when we're seeing, particularly say among the Remain voting population anyway, but with specifics in terms of reaction to law breaking that has been proven, both in terms of electoral law spending by Vote Leave and Believe, but also in the kind of not law yet, but the unethical action of the data harvesting that came with the way that Cambridge Analytica used very unethical methods to get people's information. So why is the British population still so apathetic and not reacting to this if we have a history of rebellion? So that's one. Linked to the data element and social media, you called and it's quoted as an act of self-harm, which kind of supposes that we are the architects of our own downfall. But thinking about social media, what about those transnational influences on the vote? How does the kind of manipulation of information, fake news, whatever you want to call it, play into this, the mass data harvesting and the creation of these echo chambers that fostered certain types of conversation? Where does this psychology fit into this broader history that you're narrating for us? And if I can get one more cheeky question in, just building on something you mentioned at the beginning, I totally agree that Theresa May is bizarrely preserving the party at the moment. When I did have a sense of her that she had more of a stronger sense of public duty. So where has this, both in the Labour and Conservative Party, where has this come from, this preserving the party above all else? How does that fit into this wider history?
Okay.
All right. So what I think is important when we're doing this kind of analysis is that sometimes you get hung up on the shorter term causes of a crisis. So what I've tried to do this is correct that, and I might have overcorrected it. And actually you'll see a little bit more of the other things in the second half of the talk. But I think that Britain was a very open economy, and we were hugely affected in the 2008 global recession, and you realise that we had to save the banks, and it's estimated that every family, every household has had to spend something like £7,000 over a number of years to rescue the economy. I mean, that's a phenomenal transfer of resources, and we are now hugely in debt. We've managed to defer what should be a very big crisis through, I think, old-fashioned Keynesianism. We've been spending money and trying to keep demand up and keep the economy going. So we actually have within Britain a relatively disguised but not hidden economic crisis, which we've managed to spread over 7 or 8 years. And that has impacted very unevenly in the country. So as I mentioned before, there are whole pockets of areas. I mean, we tend to think of them as, Cornwall, I showed that slide on Cornwall, I'm going to come back to it. Cornwall, North East and so on, and Wales and bits of Scotland, very, very badly hit. But if you like, the southern the southeast corridor, still doing very well, doing good business, and so on. So this sense of division in the country has been enormous, and that clearly played heavily in the vote. When you have a referendum, it's a relatively unusual and now probably considered quite a dangerous tactic. I mean, virtually all referendums that have happened around Europe have been going wrong. There've been quite a few. People don't actually vote on the issue. They use it as a form of kind of protest. And since nobody was representing what are now colloquially called left-behinders in the previous elections, this was their chance to actually express their views. So that form of saying, look, we matter, we're English, you haven't looked at the whole country, you talk about us, you talk about the many, not the few, and so on, and you promise to help us. This is our chance to make a kind of protest vote. So that's how, if you like, the overall globalization has impacted on Britain and has created kind of new pockets of what one might call loosely, I mean, these are big words and they're thrown around, and I apologize for that, but a kind of nationalism. There is a friend of mine's written this book, David Goodhart. Have you heard of his book, where he talks about the somewheres and the anywheres? Okay, so the somewheres are people who, in his view, it's too simplistic, and of course many of us are both. I think all of us are both. It just depends on which bit we emphasize. We are probably in this room anywheres. Okay, we're slightly cosmopolitan, we're global, we travel, we have enough money, we have friends in cities. We don't have friends in countries. You don't say, I've got an Australian friend. You probably say, I've got a friend in Melbourne, right? Because we're so cosmopolitan. We operate very loosely, and it's nothing of going to stay with people across the world at least once or twice a year. So we're the anywheres, okay? We also have a hometown, but it's somewhere there, and we don't often talk about it. But the somewheres actually live in a community, and they might have, if they don't now, because life's changed, at least their grandfather probably worked in a local factory, their relatives are still around, and so on, and they have a sense of this belonging. And they have seen their communities affected economically in terms of decline, probably socially in terms of less spending, because Britain's got much less spending. And there's a slide I'm going to show you about how there's a correlation between the areas where public spending was reduced and where they voted more Brexit. Okay, but thirdly, and crucially, they will probably have had more migrants coming into that area. Okay, and wrongly, and I emphasize this, wrongly, they will have thought that the migrants take their jobs, but there's no exact substitute. Actually, migrants tend to contribute to the economy. And they'll also think that they've reduced their wages. And there's a dispute. Some economists say, yes, it has reduced wages by having a greater pool of labour. Others say that it hasn't. And it depends on whether they people who operate the rules or not. We tend to have slightly more, we're not as informal economy as India, but we have more of an informal economy than most European countries, so people can just come in and get a half wage for doing some waitressing or whatever. So that's how, I mean, I'm beginning to answer it, but I haven't done it fully. Okay, you're absolutely right about, I haven't talked about the social media. I think I have some slides, but they weren't in this particular package. Why on earth aren't we more angry about it? I don't know why. Why aren't Remainers more angry? I think partly because we're Remainers for all sorts of different reasons. Maybe Remainers are more decent. Maybe they're just less, they're less angry. But there are protests in the street, but they're not violent, and they're kind of organised, and they're kind of genteel. And these people outside Parliament every day waving their flags and so on. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it is shocking. But I suppose what I feel about Britain, and I think this is a plus, I mean it's an unfortunate plus, is that we're being quite democratic. I feel there's a gridlock in the country because two types of democracy have clashed. Okay, you've got the so-called will of the people. I mean, we don't really know what the will of the people is, but it's so-called will of the people. The narrative has got set. We should have challenged it earlier, but it's got set. And that's through the referendum. And oh boy, you know, you should honour that. And then you've got the normal parliamentary sovereignty, where MPs decide through representative government. Okay, so you've got Rousseau on the one hand, and you've got Burke on the other hand, and both horses are running, and unfortunately, it's almost a dead heat. Okay, and not only is it a dead heat, but on either side, in each party, there's kind of almost even divides. Okay. And I was talking to Veselin before, and no leadership. Okay, so you've got a kind of perfect storm. No leader that can be trusted to lead you out, whichever way. No party that can take a particular stance because they're both divided. Very even, and funny enough, in the 2 years, Jessica, you would have thought that the evidence would have meant that there would have been more Remainers gradually. We know there are more Remainers because, and I'm going to show you, the young vote remaining, and there's 2 years worth of young people, and 2 years worth of old people who've died. Okay, some people say it could be 1.5 million switch, but the polls don't go. I mean, it's still 55-45. That's not significant enough. If it was 65-35, then I think the whole mood of the country would change. So I don't know why the polls are not fisting. Some people talk about what's called the psychological effect, and that is that if a decision is made, however you disagree with it, you tend to say, well, that decision's made, I ought to go along with it, or I want to go along with it because it's the winning team. So there's some of that, and you hear a lot of people saying, don't talk to me about Brexit, just sort it, you know? And that's sort of going along. I mean, so many people of that view, they're tired of it, you know, and they're not actually thinking it through. So you're absolutely right. I don't know why generally cases about unpicking elections don't tend to be successful. I mean, people, I think of the Allahabad case we were talking about it. Yes, I mean, generally people don't tend to kind of unpick the system, but there is scope for that. And, you know, Aaron Banks' money and so on. I mean, there's so much scope. But we should have done that early on. We should have done it straight away. This wonderful woman, Gina Miller, did a terrific court case in which she got Parliament to discuss it. But she had to go, I mean, it went to the Supreme Court. It was knife edge. It took a long time. Where is that? Where is the protest movement? Maybe people like me should be angrier and leading it. And we do things. We're meetings. We're going on marches and so on, lobbying people. But you're right. There's no. It should be. I mean, it's more serious than anything. So it should.
I think it's partially what you say as well, that Remain has many subsections. People don't have something to collectively mobilise around because people disagree over what Remain should or what the alternative should look like.
We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll have to go on a break. So,
thank you. My name is Kumar. I'm from journalism school. In reference to fake news we just had, and you mentioned Boris Johnson. Actually, Boris Johnson made his debut in the debate with a torrent of fake news as Brussels correspondent for The Spectator, I think.
Correct.
I think this story about bananas have to be of a certain shape to qualify for EU trade rules came from him, and that was one of several that he put out. So it's rather interesting that a man of that background comes to hold a very senior position in the UK cabinet. But you repeatedly referred to Farage here, but was he such an important player in this debate? Because what happened with the Tories is they were bitterly divided. Mm-hmm. There was Boris Johnson and Gov and so on. All fraternity boys from, I think, Oxford, and they all went to the same colleges and shared the same kind of social fraternities and so on. It was essentially a debate between them and certain others within the Tories. And the Labour Party was lukewarm. It had no particularly strongly stated view on this. And in fact, Corbyn, people say, tended to tilt towards exit because he saw this as part of the whole sinister globalization, elite-led globalization, which was selling the British working class short and so on. So the question goes back to probably the years of Thatcher, when you had an assault on organized working class and virtual dissolution of union power and a loss of industrial strength, deindustrialization of Britain. And you get sucked into this kind of vortex of global finance, in a leading role of course, but in a position where you are kind of conduit for financial flows from Europe and the surplus countries of the Arab world and of late China and so on towards the USA. And the UK is consistently running very large trade deficits through all this entire period. So there's a loss of economic viability in that sense, increasing dependence on finance. And so isn't that the perfect context for people? Firstly, you have the dissolution of the unions, the loss of organized working class strength, and you have this increasing concentration of power in the city, London. And isn't that the perfect recipe for people to just feel completely alienated from the system and to look for some kind of scapegoat or the other? So, so is the remedy, this kind of indifference that the Labour is showing? Because if I remember the 2008 meltdown, you had Labour Party in power at that time, and their response was classic Keynesian. Their response was, Gordon Brown there. The Tories who came to power in 2010 started the austerity regime. So that is what's really squeezed livelihoods and welfare across the board. And, so essentially these factors, how much do they have a bearing on this? The industrialization, the loss of organized working class strength, and austerity. Austerity is primary in that.
All right, Nitin?
Okay, my question is also related to transnational finance and its effect on various nation states. I would like to start with saying that the phenomena that we are seeing of Brexit, which you already pointed out. I'm Nitin from the International Affairs School of Thought. Okay, the phenomena of Brexit that we are seeing, it is not something new. It has happened in one or the other way in the past 300, 400, 500 years. Nationalists, populists, not just in the UK, but also in, let's say, Herr Gauland from Alternative für Deutschland, or Nigel Farage, who has used the words repeatedly, a simple free trade agreement, using the word simple to simplify complex phenomena of the 21st century. I'm taking the words of Martin Schulz from his address to the Bundestag in September 2018, last year, to simplify complex phenomena of the 21st century, transnational forces of the 21st century, to a couple of sentences, and this is what the populists have engaged in.
Yeah.
This has happened in the last 300 years, 400 years. Brexit is not, it was just contingent on certain events. But do you think, and I'm going to use the words of Jürgen Habermas here, do you think this time, given, and this is my question, do you think this time, given that Britain is no longer one of the top 5 powers, it is not the superpower like it was in the late 19th century, in the early parts of the 20th century, and very soon, according to forecasts, very soon, in 25 years, it is going to be number 10, perhaps beyond number 10. This time, they are mistaken, because no longer can the nation state deal with the forces the complex forces which I just mentioned. No longer can the nation state deal with, because transnational political capabilities are a requirement, and that's exactly what Brexit is.
Two interesting questions. So let me. I won't be too long because we should be having a break. First of all, some of us do see this Brexit as a kind of protest against neoliberalist economics. Okay, so that would fit in with what you're saying. I tend to think it's a little bit too simplistic, because it smacks of the kind of intellectual trying to give some kind of order to a messy piece of politics. And maybe in 10 years' time we can look back. I mean, clearly there is that element of protest. So I think you're kind of spot on. And you're absolutely right to remind us that the destruction of the trade union movement, which in any country is very important as a kind of bulwark within the kind of democratic checks and balances framework, the disintegration of the trade union movement, very weak, very divided, and very short of numbers, means that people are feeling even more powerless because they don't have any organisation locally to protect them, and some of the localities and councils and so on. I mean, the power of councils has been greatly reduced, has been centralised, and so on and so forth. So I think that you have a very good. You've got a good framework there, but it's not that simple. I disagree with you that Farage is. I mean, he's not. He wasn't a key player in Brexit, but he was a key player in enabling Brexit, and not just because he led the party to getting 25-26% of the vote. I mean, that was crucial in making Cameron agree. I mean, what is ironic is Cameron agreed to the referendum in 2013 because he needed to keep his right wing down, and he didn't want any hemorrhaging away to the UKIP, which was growing. Okay, but he did so on the basis that he thought he'd never have to deliver it. And the shocking thing was that he won in 2015 on his own. So in other words, he actually won an election that he thought he wouldn't, because he thought he would have to share again with the Liberals. But the Liberal Party collapses because of its internal rejection on the tuition fees and other things of its leadership. So its vote from 60 seats collapses to 8. I think it's roughly right. Mm-hmm. And that is the shock. So here comes Cameron. He's in power himself, and he then looks at his pledge sheet and, oh my God, I've got this bloody referendum to give, So he then thinks that he can win it, and we can talk about he misplays his hand, so on and so forth. I think Europe misplayed their hand very badly. But Farage is crucial because UKIP is set up after the Bruges speech by an LSE academic, Professor Alan Sked, okay? It's a wilderness party. Who cares about it? 2%, 1%, 100 members here, meeting of 15 over there. Who cares about it? But suddenly it gets traction at the turn of the century. And as people feel alienated, and as they feel, and then they get intellectuals who say, look, we didn't agree to this. This is the sovereignty argument I'm trying to do. Or somehow there's a dual-headed parliament. And so when you get intellectual arguments underlying protest, then things kind of take off. On your point, I totally agree with your underlying point about the kind of binary nature of politics. I mean, people are oversimplifying complex things. And that's very, sorry, I haven't been using this. It's something like this, so complicated as we discovered. We still don't really know the ramifications of it. But I know that nobody talked about 967 treaties being renegotiated. No one talked about the fact that Britain would have to honour all the financial pledges that it made going forward 15 years, for a road in Bulgaria or whatever. If it was at the table, then it must pay, it's paying 1/5 of the budget. It must pay, that share, come what may. Nobody talked about those things. So complexity is absolutely right, and it's very difficult in politics today to, and you'll have that in this Indian election. You're already getting it. You'll have very simplified binary politics, which you will kind of deal with. Okay, so I agree totally with that and some of your other points. What I'm not sure I agree with is your point about the nation state, because I had a seminar which I organised in 1990 on the end of the nation state, and we're still here. Okay, so and every about 10 years late, I sort of have a session on the Westphalian state and the end, 1648, that the state is about to go. It's all going to be international and so on. There's no doubt that the levers that the state can control are being reduced. I mean, the internal levers, particularly economic. Okay, so they're in a sense less able to control their own agenda, particularly on economics, and so on and so forth. But the nation state is stubbornly here. And I'm not sure that we actually have any idea yet how we can organize ourselves apart from that. I know we're inching towards it and probably will end up there without even, with the intellectuals will be 10 years as usual behind, with their kind of theories and books. And we'll be in a new world and then we'll sort of catch up with it. So I'm going to be slightly provocative and say that I think the nation state is going to limp on because we've got no better way of organizing. But what will happen, and this is Europe as an example, I mean, I don't think the African Union is an example because I think theirs is it's just a kind of more of a paper organization. ASEAN, you can tell me how that's working, not very well. So there will be these trade blocs, but I'm not sure that we're ready to lose the nation state. Though, many people would say, it'd be great if we could. Okay.
Right, on that happy note, we will take about a 30 minutes break. We'll reconvene at 4 here. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.